Good morning, everyone. Okay, so now let's just go to the last module of this class, right? So in the last module, what are we going to do? So we are going to base on what we have learned in previous modules. Like say, for example, so in the module for macroeconomics, we start with measurement, right? So that's the second module because the first module essentially is a review of microeconomics. And then in the second module, we learn how to measure our economy, including the size of the economy, the aggregate price, and then we also learn how to measure labor market. Okay, and then so in the third module, the module we just finished, we learn how to make sense of those numbers, like what explain the fluctuation of GDP, right? So we based on two simple model. One is the income expenditure equilibrium model, right? And the other model is called aggregate supply and aggregate demand model, right? So based on those model, we understand so what causes the fluctuation, right? So either it's a demand shock or supply shock. So you're going to see the economy is going to respond, okay, without the intervention of the government. So eventually the economy will adjust itself and restore to the long run equilibrium. But we learn, so this adjustment process can be lengthy and it can be extremely painful in a sense. So we are going to lose lots of GDP and we are going to lose a lot of jobs, right? So create some financial hardship for the population. And so in that sense, so that just give the government some justification to intervene, right? So that's what we have learned so far. Now in this module, we are going to see so how government can intervene. Okay, so the government can intervene through two types of policy. The first, what we can learn is fiscal policy. So this is in this module. Okay, and then so in this lecture or in this chapter, so first we need to understand what fiscal policy is and why it is an important tool, okay, particularly in managing economic fluctuation. Right? And we are going to differentiate fiscal policy by expansionary versus contractionary fiscal policy, right? And then so after that, so we're going to learn, so the fiscal policy is going to have some multiplier effect. So this is probably the third time we talk about multiplier, all right? And also study why the government calculate the cyclical adjusted budget balance. It has something to do with the business cycle, okay? And then the last part, we're going to look at public debt, okay? And including the implicit liability, right? So the government are supposed to pay. So example of implicit liability is, for example, the long-term social security. Like in the future, the social security the government has promised to offer to their citizen, right? So that's kind of a liability. So that can increase the burden of public debt. Okay, so this is a roadmap of this chapter. Now let's start with the basic. Okay, so we have watched this video. So now let's go to here, fiscal policy. Okay. To understand the fiscal policy, let's first look at this picture. So here we have four countries: United States, Japan, Canada, and France. Okay, so they are common in the sense they are democratic country, so they are advanced economy, right? And the other things we learn from this graph is that across the board, all of this country has a sizable government spending, right? So let's say, for example, United States, oh, this is 2013. So if we look at 2020 or 2021, you're going to see the number is going to be even higher, right? So let's look at United States. So the government spending in 2013 was 38% of the total GDP. What that means? That just means for each $100 we collectively produced, it's $100 value of goods and a service, the U.S. economy produced or generated, $38 will be spent by the government, right? So in the following slide, you're going to see how government is going to spend this 38%. But nevertheless, this is a huge number, right? And then so you may be wondering, so why we need government to spend? And why the government spending is so big? And furthermore, so if we expand the figures by including some less developed countries, then you're going to find a surprising result. Namely, the advanced economy like US and most West European countries. So the size of government is larger than some poor country. Right? So you may be wondering, so why we need a government? Okay, so I guess this has been studied in your principal class, but I can give you a quick heads up. Okay, why we need a government? Because in reality, in our economy, due to some frictions, due to some imperfection in the market, so there are certain type of goods and service. So the private party will have no incentive to provide. The classic example is public transportation, right? So if I just pay for road to my neighborhood, okay, and so everyone is going to benefit from this road, but they can always find a way to avoid to pay for the road, right? So in that sense, so I probably won't have incentive to build this road in the first place, because I knew, so I'm not going to get what I deserve, right? And due to this, oh, by the way, so the fundamental cause of that problem is because this road is a public goods, right? So you can't prevent somebody else to use these particular goods, right? Okay, so given this friction and given this imperfection in the market, so sometimes we rely on the government to provide certain goods and a service. So that's why we need a government. But then, so over time, so the government getting bigger and bigger. Okay, so we are not going to talk about this class. So you may want to go to a more advanced class, say for example, public economics. Okay, to understand what is behind this trend. Okay, for now, let's just take this as given, and then so we are going to make sense of the role of government, and in particularly in mitigating the business cycle fluctuation. Okay, the other things we learn from this graph is that the government tax revenue usually is smaller than government spending. So government tax revenue, that's the main channel the government can collect income, right? But say for example, United States, 31 versus 38, meaning there's a 7% of shortfall. Okay. If you think about individual, that just means, so in 2013, okay, so my income is smaller than my spending. So if it's individual, what I'm going to do, so I may just borrow, either borrow from the bank or from credit card or from friend or families, right? So what will happen to the government? The story is going to be similar. The government can borrow, right? So they can borrow from public. They borrow from domestic households, banks, or they can borrow from international creditors, right? And then the government has another secret weapon. So besides they can borrow, so they can also print money, right? But we are going to discuss this money printing in the next chapter, right? So for now, let's just leave that aside. Okay. So this is a fiscal policy. This is how the reality looks like. Okay. So here, just summarize how the government is going to use their money, right? And so there are some important terms or important categories. First, it's called government transfer. Okay, so this is a payment by the government to households. But this transfer or this payment has no goods and service is provided in return. Okay, so the good example is a check we have received a few weeks ago. Right, so I believe everyone received a check of 1,400 from the government, right? And then last year we received another 2 checks. Right, the first one is 1,300, the second one is 600, right? So that is government transfer. The government gives you payment, gives you money. Okay, as a return, there's no goods and service you ask it to do. Okay, so you may be wondering why the government want to do that. What is the rationale behind that? And furthermore, what is the cause of doing that? So please hold tight. So that's what we are going to discuss in the rest of this chapter. Okay. The other important term is called social insurance program. So government program intended to protect family against economic hardship. Right. So government insurance program essentially is a type of government transfer. Okay, and this includes Social Security, which is used to protect elderly, to protect disabled. Right, Medicare, this is used to protect elderly's healthcare costs. Medicaid, which is designed to provide healthcare for lower income family. Okay. Now, this gives you a snapshot of the tax revenue in the United States. So this is 2013. So if we look at more recent data, it should be similar. Okay. So among these tax revenue, the largest source of tax coming from personal income tax. Right. So like right now, so we are filing our tax return. Okay. And then so in that tax return, so we are responsible for some income tax. That's the source. Okay, so income tax, 35%. Now another important category is social insurance tax. Okay, so what is this social insurance tax? This includes payroll tax. This includes Medicare tax, right? And so it's around less than 20%. Okay, for each individual. This tax is used to finance, in the previous slides, this tax is used to finance Social Security and Medicare, right? And then we have other tax. So this includes consumption tax. Like you go to restaurant, you go to grocery store, or you go to online shopping. So there's a tax. And we may have property tax, right? So if you own a house, and then you have to pay tax every year, right? And then lastly, we have corporate profit tax of 8%. Okay, so that's essentially, so if you have a business, and then so you have profit from your business, and then so you're going to pay tax for the profit. Okay, so this is the tax revenue. Now, this just gives you a sense how government is going to spend those tax money, right? So the biggest item in here is Medicare and then Medicaid, right, which is 70%. Now the next one is national defense, 15%, right? So actually, based on this diagram, so you can back out how much we spend on each item in terms of GDP, right? Okay, because in total spending is 38% of total GDP. Now let's just look at national defense. So national defense is going to be 15% of this 38%, right? So that just means the United States, so we roughly spend 5.5% of our total income in national defense. Okay, so next one is education. So this education includes the public funded K-12 and state university or public university, right? Also includes some R&D. Okay, now the other things I want to emphasize is the interest payment. So what is interest payment? Remember earlier I showed you the US government in 2013. So they spent more than they can collect in terms of tax revenue, right? So they spent 38% of total GDP, but the tax revenue they can collect is 31%. There's a 7% of shortfall. And then, so most of the shortfall is going to be financed by borrowing, meaning the government borrow either from domestic creditors, including households, business, banks, financial institutions, or from international. So for example, international banks or foreign governments. Okay? But then there must be a cause for you to borrow, right? And this interest payment is actually linked to the money you borrow, either from domestic or from international creditors. Okay. Now let's look at these practice questions. Government programs that are designed to protect individuals or families from economic hardship are described as. So the answer is called social insurance, right? So that is based on one slide we just learned. Okay. Okay. So now we are going to look at the role the government can play, okay, or more specifically, so how the fiscal policy can help the economy. We are going to start from this equation. Sorry, we have seen this equation several times. So this equation essentially just says, so we can calculate GDP by looking at total expenditure. So this total expenditure includes private consumption, okay, investment, government, and net export. Okay, so by looking at this equation, so first of all, government can control their G, right? So how the government can control the G? So they simply just increase the spending, right? And then, so maybe there's some skeptical says, no, so this is not a good idea. So the government changes spending. It just waste of the resource, but not necessary, right? For a couple of reasons. First, at some point, like last year or right now, so the private sector may not want to spend. So in that sense, the government spending will have some real impact. Okay, and then number two. So the private spending may not be productive. Okay, so for example, if people spend their money in buying some entertainment, buying some recreational things, okay, it may not have much impact on the economy. Hence, the government may can use the resource or the money to do some productive investment. So that's going to be better, right? So this G. The government can directly control G. Now the government can indirectly control C and I. Okay, why? Because the government can affect households' income through tax or through transfer, right? So that's going to affect consumption. And similarly, so how the government can affect investment by changing tax, right? So this summarized by here. So households' income are affected by tax and transfer. Business investment affected by tax and regulation. Okay, so the government has the ability to change aggregate spending, and furthermore, to affect the aggregate demand. Okay, and then so in terms of fiscal policy, so this is defined as the use of taxes, government transfer, or government purchase of goods and service to shift the aggregate demand curve. So the key here is aggregate demand. Okay, so the government wants to use those tools, either tax or transfer or purchase of goods and service, to shift the aggregate demand. Right? And a different administration may have different preference. Okay, President Bush, so he tried tax cut, and President Obama, so he's going to use a different approach, like increasing aggregate spending or increasing transfer. Right? Okay. Now we are going to look at the first characterization of fiscal policy. Okay. Expansionary versus contractionary. What is expansionary? So this is fiscal policy that increase aggregate demand. Okay, if a government action in terms of fiscal policy can increase aggregate demand, then we call this expansionary. But how the government policy can increase aggregate demand is going to through the following three possibilities. Either there's an increase in government purchase of goods and service. Okay, so that just direct impact on aggregate expenditure. Or if there's a cut in tax, okay, so that's indirectly. So that's going to affect C and I. Or so there's an increase in government transfer. Okay, so that's going to increase C indirectly. Right? So this is expansionary fiscal policy. And expansionary fiscal policy, so one intuitive way to understand that, you can understand this as giving extra fuels for the economy. It's like your car, right? So you are going to add some fuels, or in these days, you add some battery powers to your car. So your car can run faster and run longer. Okay, so this is expansionary fiscal policy. Now, let's just use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram we studied in previous chapter to understand this expansionary fiscal policy. Okay. Currently, we are in E1. Okay. And compared to the long run aggregate supply, we see we produce less than we potentially can produce. Okay. And then we are in a recessionary gap. Okay. And remember, in the previous chapter, we say, so for now, we focus on demand shock. And then, so you should realize, so actually, so the reason why we are here is caused by a negative demand shock. So maybe just initially, that's where we start. Right? Okay. So now, what the government can do. Okay. So without government intervention, we have learned in previous chapter. So this recessionary gap, meaning the unemployment rate is high, meaning over time, the wage will go down, or will go down. Okay, and finally, so the lower nominal wage in the medium term or long term will help the aggregate supply. So eventually we will restore the long run aggregate equilibrium. Okay, But so this adjustment process will be lengthy and it can be painful to the economy. So now let's see what the government can do. Okay, so maybe the government can carry out some expansionary fiscal policy, including cut tax, increase transfer, or increase government spending. So that's going to lift off aggregate demand. Okay, so and then so we can move back to the equilibrium. Okay, so this is expansionary fiscal policy. Right, so from A1, so 81 to 82, the move is caused by expansionary fiscal policy instead of waiting the economy to respond. By the way, if we leave the economy alone and let the economy to adjust, so we will go through something like here. Okay, so that's what we're going to achieve, or where we are going to end up with. Right. Now look at other possible fiscal policy or order type. Okay. So this is called contractionary. So contractionary fiscal policy is opposite to expansionary. So this is like put brakes for the economy. Right? So you want the economy to go slow. How the government can do, essentially, they are going to reduce the aggregate demand, okay, by a reduction in government purchase of goods and service. So this is decrease G. Or increase in tax, so that's going to indirectly affect C and I. Or there's a reduction in government transfer, so that's going to affect C as well, but indirectly. Right. Okay, similarly, we can look at this diagram to understand how contractionary fiscal policy may help or how that work. Okay, so currently we are at E1. Okay, at E1, so we in the inflationary gap. So our output is above our potential, right? And again, so given we look at demand shock, so this is likely caused by a positive demand shock. Okay. Now, without the government intervention, what is going to happen next? So this is going to lead low unemployment in the market, and the market is going to adjust by raising nominal wage. So higher nominal wage will push down the aggregate supply. And eventually we are going to see the economy is going to restore to long run equilibrium, right? So that is without government intervention. Now what the government can do, so they may just carry out some contractionary fiscal policy, increase in tax, decrease government spending, or reduce the government transfer. Okay, so now we are going to push down to E2. Okay, so this is contractionary fiscal policy. Now let's look at these practice questions. So do you think the government is right to begin massive spending program during deep recession? Okay, so what are examples of deep recession? 1929. We have Great Depression. 2020. So we have this great lockdown. And so the economy is in a deep recession. Okay, in 2020, in the worst day, so the unemployment rate is close to 20%, right? And so the government massive spending will help to restore the economy back to long run potential, right? So hence it makes sense for it makes sense for government to intervene. Okay. Now let's look at another practice question. Suppose a country wishes to produce at its potential output level, holding everything else constant, identify which of the following policy might help it reach its goal and how this policy would help. Let's go one by one. A. The government initiate policy that encourage private investment spending. So the government initiate private investment spending. So that's considered expansionary, right? And that's going to lead the aggregate demand curve to shift to right. Okay, so that's going to help to produce at its potential. Okay. Now we go to B. The government increases the amount of money it borrows in the loanable fund market to increase the level of government spending in the economy. Okay, so B will cause the aggregate demand increase or shift to the right, unless the increase in government borrowing crowd out private investment. Or usually, so the government increase amount of money will help the aggregate demand, except in the case if the government borrow too much and then they are going to dry up the available fund in the financial market. So that is going to crowd out private consumption, private investment. Right? So by the way, so this is the things we are going to discuss in the following few slides. Okay. C. The government increase taxes on consumer and corporations. So that's going to be counterproductive, right? So that's going to discourage consumption and investment. D. The government authorize new spending programs. Yes, that's going to help the aggregate demand, right? Because that's going to have a direct effect on aggregate demand. Okay, so or the answer is in the next slides, so you can read this yourself. Okay. Now we are going to go next slides. Okay. So there are some critiques regarding to the effectiveness of expansionary fiscal policy, or there's some doubt on whether we should rely on expansionary fiscal policy to help our economy. Okay. So these doubts are summarized by here. Okay. First, someone may argue government spending always crowd out private spending, meaning so if the government spend and then so there are less resource the private sector can spend. This is the first critique. The second critique says government borrowing always crowd out private investment spending, meaning so if the government borrow more and then there less money available for the rest of the economy to borrow, meaning the private investment will slow down. Third, government budget deficit reduce private spending. They just says if government borrow to spend and then households will have less money to spend, hence that's going to reduce private spending. Okay. So now we are going to answer these critiques one by one. Okay, but again, as usual, let's just take a few minutes break.